My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and watching the Lord of the Rings again for multiple reasons, and reading it for the first time to my oldest child, it was interesting to me to come across the scene where Galadriel says that she can't see Gandalf from afar, and the scene is different in the movie and the book in a subtle respect, which I'll get into in a minute. But the reason it became interesting to me was it kind of begged the question, how could she see him at all? And so I went around and started looking at different things that might explain why she might be seeing Gandalf at all, because the specific way she words it in the book makes that not quite so obvious as you might think. So let's look at the data a little bit and see if we can come up with any conclusions on this point. First, let's start with Galadriel's own words in the book, and I'll explain the difference between the book and the movie in a second. But in the book, she says, "There was no change of counsel. Gandalf the Grey set out with the company, but he did not pass the borders of this land. Now tell us where he is, for I much desired to speak with him again, but I cannot see him from afar unless he comes within the fences of Lothlorien. A grey mist is about him, and the ways of his feet and of his mind are hidden from me." Now this is interesting for a few reasons. The difference here between the book and the movie is that in the movie, when Galadriel speaks up and says this bit, she just says, "I can no longer see him from afar." And she doesn't mention specifically within the fences of Lothlorien. And the implication in the movie, therefore, is she can't see him anymore because he's dead. So, that's kind of a different thing altogether. But here she seems to be making a more general statement, which is, in general, I can't see him because there's a gray mist about him unless he comes within the fences of Lothlorien, in which case I can actually pinpoint where he is. Which is an interesting distinction, I guess, because we can come up with a few different ways of thinking about how she can locate him at all, but all of them seem a little weird in terms of explaining why they would work only in Lothlorien, but not elsewhere. So it's going to be interesting to take a look at that. Of course, our first possible explanation for this is the Mirror of Galadriel. And the reason we can rightly suspect the mirror is because she straight up tells Frodo and Sam, "Many things I can command the mirror to reveal, and to some I can show what they desire to see. But the mirror will also show things unbidden, and those are often stranger and more profitable than things which we wish to behold." So she tells the hobbits she can command the mirror to reveal some things, even to other people. So clearly there's some control she has over what the mirror will show her. The weird thing, though, is that if she can command the mirror to show her things, why would it not be able to show her precisely where Gandalf is, except when he's within the fences of Lothlorien? Seems a little odd. I mean, it's odd no matter how you explain Galadriel's ability to see him at all, but it just seems kind of strange that the mirror would be able to show her things on command, but not where Gandalf is, except within a specific geofence location, which I don't know how that's supposed to work exactly. I suppose because Lothlorien is under the influence of her ring, that might have something to do with it, but otherwise I really can't explain why that specific boundary would matter much. It also just seems weird in general that she would be able to see Gandalf only within Lothlorien, and that otherwise a gray mist is about him and she can't see him or his thoughts. And we'll get to the thoughts bit a little bit later because that brings up another possibility. But in this particular instance, if we're thinking of the Mirror of Galadriel, it's not even 100% clear that the mirror can show where people are on command. It could be more like a Palantir in that maybe the mirror only can show her things on command that she already knows about, and obviously she doesn't know about Gandalf's location. So the way the Palantir works, for example, is you can use the Palantir to show you a specific location that you know about, and if the person you're looking for happens to be there, cool, you found that person. But you can't just tell the Palantir, show me Gandalf. It's not a crystal ball like that. And so it doesn't just show you who you want to see, it can show you where you want to look. Very different thing. Does the mirror work in the same way? That's actually, a topic all unto itself, because how does the mirror even work? The interesting thing about the mirror is there's kind of two things that are kind of significant about it. One is it's from the water of this particular river, and this river starts in, well, stream really is what it is, where it is at this point, but it starts at a stream that starts in Lothlorien itself. So you might argue perhaps that the mirror has more efficacy within the bounds of Lothlorien because the water is in Lothlorien. The other significant thing about the mirror is that somehow the light of the Star of Eärendil seems to be important in, how it functions, because that's the only other thing that's mentioned regarding the mirror at all. And the light of Eärendil is important only insofar as it tells us that Eärendil, who from the Silmarillion we know to be an actual person sailing up in the sky, not merely a ball of gas, since he's sailing up in the sky, theoretically he's a person who is not a Vala or a Maya, who sees everything because he's up above looking down at everything. So potentially the mirror is using the sight of Eärendil himself to perceive things going on in Middle-earth, and somehow that sight gets transferred into the water upon which the light of Eärendil shines. That's really mysticky, and it doesn't really make a whole lot of scientific sense, obviously, but there's no other basis for explaining how the mirror works, so that's what I'm going with. That being the case, why doesn't it show Gandalf? Why would it not? Because it's not like Gandalf walks around with a cloud of literal gray mist obscuring his location all the time. That's not what Galadriel is saying. When she says a gray mist, I don't think she's talking about a literal fog. She is using a metaphor of some kind, and it's not exactly clear how that works or what she means, but it definitely means that there is some limit to her ability to perceive where he is. Now, once we accept this much, we can understand, maybe, like I said, why the Lothlorien connection matters, perhaps because of the river that she gets, or the stream that she gets the water from, or because of the influence of her ring. But it also just seems a little weird because, again, if the mirror can show her things on command, let's assume for sake of argument that it doesn't include show me this person. Well, then it doesn't help explain how she could see Gandalf from afar anyway. Her words to the company seem to imply that on a normal day and regarding a normal person, she could see a person other than Gandalf whenever she wanted, which is kind of freaky to think about, actually, because, that's a better than Palantir-like capacity that she has, which is really, really interesting. But she can't see Gandalf from afar. Why would she call out her inability to see Gandalf from afar unless she has the ability to see other people from afar, whether or not they're in Lothlorien? See what I mean? The way she words that implies something about her abilities beyond what she's saying about Gandalf. Otherwise, it's weird that she would call that out specifically. So it's kind of bizarre that she would have this ability, because even the Palantiri can't do that. So how is she doing it? Maybe the mirror can actually show her, hey, show me this person. And if it can, then the question arises again, why not Gandalf? Does Eärendil not have the ability to see Gandalf walking around in the wilderness when he's literally just walking around in the wilderness? Because the interesting thing is, we also know that Frodo sees Gandalf in the mirror. Frodo, one of his visions is an old man kind of walking along a path, and at first he thinks it's Gandalf, and then he's like, well, no, he's dead. Maybe it's Gandalf in the past, because the mirror can show things past and future in addition to the present, which is, again, different than the Palantir. And then he's like, well, maybe it's Saruman, or, he can't come up with a sure theory of who he thinks this figure is. But given what we know later, it's almost certain that he probably is witnessing Gandalf. So he can see persons, including Gandalf. Now, is he only able to see Gandalf in this particular instance because it was not a thing that Galadriel commanded and something that the mirror showed unbidden? Maybe, because that would explain at least why Galadriel would phrase it, I can not see him from afar, unless he comes within the fences of Lothlorien, because it's not like she's the one seeing it. She has to rely on, the mirror basically giving her what she wants without her telling it what she wants, if you know what I mean, which is, it's not quite the same literally as I can never see him at all, but it's close enough, because it's like the mirror is not just going to show you exactly what you want when you want it if you're not trying to make it do that. So it's at the same time, I want to see this, but also I'm not telling you to show me that. You know what I mean, man? So you could see why the mirror wouldn't show you a thing you wanted to see at all if it couldn't already do that, so that it's not kind of cheating the system in a way, because that's basically what that would be. If the mirror showed you something that you wanted to see, just by chance, as it were, as opposed to by command, that's kind of a loophole. So, you can understand why maybe that wouldn't work. And so Galadriel's words can still make sense as a, I can't see him at will. Maybe I get lucky and see him in the mirror if I get, a lucky shot that I'm not thinking about Gandalf at all and the mirror just happens to show me. But I can't go to it and say, I want to see Gandalf now. Where is he? Because that the mirror can't do. The mirror can't just, show you on command another person. So, yeah, that's kind of weird to think about. Now, the other thing that she mentions is that Gandalf's thoughts are veiled. Now, this gets interesting because we have later writing by Tolkien, and by later, Karl Hofstadter in his Nature of Middle-earth has this piece called the Osanwe Quinta, and it's all about mental communication. And he says that Christopher Tolkien, in another volume of the History of Middle-earth, dated the set of papers in which it's found to probably 1959 or 1960, which is several years after the final, book was published. So this doesn't necessarily tell us anything about what Tolkien had in mind when he wrote this passage, because maybe he came up with this idea later, but it is close enough that it would be reasonable to, maybe infer that this is, the two passages are at least connected. Maybe when Tolkien wrote what he wrote about Galadriel here, and what he later writes in The Return of the King, where Elrond and Galadriel and Gandalf are all sitting there quietly passing their thoughts back and forth to each other. Maybe that's, connected, or at least got him started thinking down the line that got him to what he later wrote in the Osanwe Quinta. Not clear, but certainly the two ideas are connected. Can Galadriel just read his mind and figure out where he is? This is the interesting thing, because according to the Osanwe Quinta, distance doesn't actually matter. In fact, it says because the incarnates find it easier to communicate with language, they don't use the Osanwe Quinta or the Osanwe generally, because it's a little more murky in terms of communication, unless they're out of range of hearing, because distance doesn't matter for Osanwe. Okay, now we know that Elrond and Galadriel actually can like communicate long range like we see them in the movie, where, you know, Elrond and Galadriel seem to be having this mental communication all the way, you know, from the distance of Lothlorien and Rivendell. Apparently that could actually happen. Peter Jackson wouldn't have known that at the time because that, you know, text hadn't been published yet, but lucky him, I guess. But the point is, Galadriel says she can't do that with Gandalf either because his mind, you know, his mind and his thoughts are also clouded by this gray mist. So that doesn't work either. But we do have something in the Osanwe talking about the openness or closedness of a mind. And the closedness of the mind is not the natural state, but any mind can close itself and therefore, you know, keep other people from reading it. And there is no possible way to break that barrier, according to this text. And therefore, if Gandalf just has a desire to keep his mind shut off from anybody who might try to read it, nobody can break that. Now, that doesn't mean that he couldn't open it if he had some indication that Galadriel was trying to communicate with him. And again, Galadriel's words seem to imply that there's just something unique about Gandalf, not merely that he is closing off his mind in this way, because she talks about his, you know, his ways being shrouded by a gray mist and all this, as if he is somehow special. Now, is that because Gandalf is a Maya who is kind of unnaturally, as it were, placed in a body, and therefore that kind of fiddles with the workings of all these different things? Who knows? I mean, it's really hard to explain any of this because we're just not given enough information. You know, the idea that she could read his mind also doesn't necessarily even tell us that she'd be able to discern his location from that. The idea to communicate thoughts with somebody doesn't imply you have to know where they are. According to the Osanwe, basically one mind can just sense another. And if distance doesn't matter, then neither does location, really, if you think about it. So all I have to know is another mind exists, and I can feel it somehow. So it's really interesting to think about the fact that Galadriel could, in theory, talk to Gandalf anytime she wanted to via mental telepathy, but can't because his thoughts are veiled. But she could do it with Elrond, you know, just fine. So why on earth is Gandalf so unique in this respect? It's really strange to think about. So the mirror doesn't seem like a very good explanation, or at least maybe, but it seems kind of strange to square that with the way she words what she says. The ability to mind read doesn't really seem to solve the problem. What else is there? I mean, does she have a Palantir hiding out that, you know, was lost long ago and she found and kept? And I mean, that obviously I'm being facetious here a little bit, but it's not impossible that Galadriel could come up with a Palantir. But again, even the Palantir wouldn't show her Gandalf. It would show her locations which may or may not be where Gandalf is. So that doesn't solve the problem. What is she referring to then? It's really weird, and this is why I wanted to talk about it, because when I read this passage not too long ago, I was like, what is she actually talking about? Because if you actually take her words here and about the mirror and this other stuff, it's really hard to explain what she means, actually. And it's, you know, it's one of those things where Tolkien usually says things and then he might come along and explain later in a theory what he means in some later writing, but he never explains this one, at least not to my knowledge with any of the published works. So it gets to the question of, are we supposed to assume something about her ability that we just aren't told explicitly, or did Tolkien himself not really have any idea, and this is just like one of those many things that he wrote that he only later thought about more and came up with explanations, except in this case he doesn't seem to have done that. That's a really interesting question. So I don't know of a third, good possibility to explore besides the mirror and Osanwe, and yet neither of them seem terribly good as explanations. So what I am left with as a best of all possible alternatives is the idea that, for one thing, I think one explanation that we can give for not being able to read Gandalf's thoughts and this whole gray mist idea, clearly she has mental communication with Gandalf later when he's Gandalf the White. And I suspect that may have something to do with the fact that as Gandalf the Grey, he is in a lot of ways as a Maya more limited than he will be later as Gandalf the White. Because one thing that Tolkien tells us in other writings is that the Astari have a lot of their memories clouded and they don't remember the West as it was very clearly. They just kind of long for it and know it kind of fuzzily. And so when he comes back as the White, he's probably not shrouded in that same way, let's say. And if that's true, that would explain why she can communicate with him mentally after his change to Gandalf the White, but not before. Something about his being a Maya incarnated into a body is fiddling with the system in some way. If that's true, it might also have something to do with the idea of where he is. It might be something about that kind of mismatch of the spirit that he is and the body he's inhabiting, which is not merely a clothing, which is what the Ainur usually do. Manwe can clothe himself and so appear in bodily form, but he's not just in a body, as it were. Gandalf and the other Istari are just in bodies. Something about this arrangement may have effects on whatever is going on, such that there's just kind of a static, sort of, in the way that these detection mechanisms might work. So if that's the case, then maybe the mirror could potentially normally show you just, hey, I want to see person, okay? And therefore she could see where Frodo was, for instance, 15 days after he leaves Lothlorien, even though she might not be able to do a whole lot about it. She could potentially just command the mirror to show her Frodo Baggins, and boom, there he is. And if that's true, that would, possibly explain a lot of things. And it might also be that Frodo, whenever he sees Gandalf the White because he's seeing him in the present, which is after, he's been changed into Gandalf the White. But actually this explanation doesn't work either, because according to the Tale of Years, the Mirror of Galadriel and Gandalf's resurrection happen on the same day, and it just says that Gandalf lies in a trance on the peak, whereas what Frodo sees is him walking on a path, clothed, whereas Gandalf says he was sent back naked. So there's a lot of discrepancies there that you can't explain. So is Frodo seeing him in the past or in the future? That's actually a really interesting question. But he's not seeing him in the present, seemingly. That being the case, we can't really use that as an explanation for how he could see Gandalf just because he's now Gandalf the White and the shroud is lifted. He might be seeing something in the future, which if he's seeing Gandalf the White in the future, maybe that would have some explanatory power, because if Erindil's star can see Gandalf in the into the future a little bit, and is somehow privy to, let's say, the music of the Ainur, and therefore can predictively see Gandalf into the future, maybe that means that, he's... It's just so weird to think about. I mean, the explanations all seem to fall flat at some level. Do you see what I mean? But, potentially maybe he could be seeing Gandalf in the future because Eärendil can see him in the future in some way. It's so weird to think about. But then again, Lothlorien and time itself are kind of in a fuzzy relationship. The other thing, though, is, again, it could possibly be, but again, I doubt it, that Elendil can show Gandalf not at will, but just by chance because of whatever this static is between, Gandalf's spirit and his body. Elendil can't just perfectly geolocate him on command, but might happen to figure out where he is by luck and therefore show him. That's the best explanation I can think of. And I'm still not extremely satisfied with it. You really have to wonder, what is Galadriel talking about in this passage? It just seems so weird. No matter how you think about it, there always seems to be one little hiccup to the theory that you use to explain it, at least every theory I've come up with. But it is an interesting, factoid to explore precisely for this reason, because it leads us to ask all these different questions about what is Galadriel doing? How is she doing it? Where does this come from? And why is Gandalf seemingly a special exception? It's kind of bizarre. But if you can come up with a better theory than me, please do leave it in the comments, because, like I said, I'm not entirely satisfied with any explanation I've come up with, but the best one I can think of is Elendil can spot Gandalf by luck and therefore show it in the mirror, not on command, but can't on command be like, hey, I know where he is, he's right there. That just seems so odd to me, but it's the best that I can come up with, because everything else seems to have just an outright, real logical contradiction type problem. So that's all I can come up with at all that seems even plausible, and it still doesn't seem right. But, if you at least like the discussion, leave a like, share it around. Maybe other people can come up with a better explanation than any of us. Who knows? And if you want to catch more of my content in the future, make sure you subscribe, and on YouTube, click the bell icon. Check the description for more social and support links, including on the platform formerly known as Twitter, where I drop regular Tolkien-related trivia questions. And until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially Nathan Dufour, Paul Leone, Robert Kindling, and Stephen Clayton.